Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course, Disaster Recovery and Build Back Better. So today, this is going to be our last lecture for this whole course. And I'm going to summarize everything, the whole journey from the starting to the ending. So what we have given to you and what is the summary of it, what is the gist of this particular each modules and what we are taking home, So that is, the kind of conclusion. So this is going to be the last lecture. And first of all, I really thank all the participants who have taken this course patiently and giving all the assignments and listening to all our lectures. And they're obviously coping up with different dialects and different terminology and learning new things and also interacting with us in between. So I really have taken this opportunity, and myself and Shubhajit Samadda who have really cooperated with us in making this course a very fruitful course with his all very interesting illustrations, explanations, the theoretical grinding on it. So that's it. This course without all this support, it has not been very fruitful. But I'm going to give you a kind of summary what all we have covered. First of all, this course, the way we planned, disaster recovery and build back better. So it has 8 modules. The first module was about introduction to disaster risk recovery and the build back better. So it actually gives the theoretical understanding of what is a risk, what is a hazard, and what is vulnerability, and what is actually a build back better, what is the perspectives, different perspectives of build back better. So this gives the first module, the way we designed was it has to ice break them, because different student participants, whether there will be many people who are faculty, there are many people who are students, there are many people from bachelor's, master's, or from non-architecture backgrounds as well. But then the first basic module gives you the very fundamental understandings of the terminology: risk, vulnerability, hazards, disaster, development, and the build back better. So the second module, what we did was how one can understand the vulnerability, and also we have brought the culture, how the cultural dimension into the vulnerable aspect and how culture becomes at risk. Culture is at risk. So here we did discuss about various tools and methods of mapping the vulnerability, and especially in cultural context. So once you are familiar with the theoretical understanding, the second you are familiar with some of the mapping techniques of it, and getting familiar with different challenging context. So we moved on our discussions with the organizational setup and the role of built environment professions. So here we did talked about what are the various setups, the hierarchies in an institutional setup, the frameworks, the guidances. So all these things and the role of built environment professionals, whether it is a role of architect, what is the role of an engineer, what is the role of a surveyor, and what is the role of a planner. So in that way we try to pull it together, the whole organizational setup of the DRR. Then we moved on with the timeline process of pre-disaster to the post-disaster process. So once if you have a theoretical background of these 3 modules, what is the theory related to it, and some of the tools on vulnerability, understanding the vulnerability and with the context. Then we try to give you an understanding of the setup of various organizations, the governance setups. And from here we moved on with the stage wise disaster, from pre-disaster to the post-disaster. So here the fourth module covers up disaster risk reduction and the pre-disaster planning, how one can prepare. This is where we talked about the preparedness programs, and also we've given various live case studies across the globe. In the whole course, the good thing about this course is we actually brought the theory, and in parallelly we discussed about a variety of cases across the globe so that we can learn from each other. It is not only focusing on the India, but it has the learnings from Peru, Colombia, Turkey. So across the globe we have covered a variety of cases. Then immediately after the disaster, the relief, recovery and transition. What is the transition phase? The relief phase of it and the temporary housing. So that is where we discussed about the Kenyan case studies and other case studies as well. And then in a large amount, I think in the whole course, we discussed about the reconstruction, the post-disaster reconstruction. So that is where the tsunami recovery programs, which is my own areas, and also we did discuss about the rebuilding of Kiruna, which is also my own career, that we discussed in the culture part of it. And there are also other aspects in Peru, El Salvador, Colombia, the coffee growers communities, how they have worked on Turkey, how the small actors make a big difference in it. So in that way we brought a variety of cases in it. Then in the seventh module we talked about the assessments, the global assessment reports, and what are the procedures one has to look at it. Each report have how they have actually, what is their focus of the assessment and what methodology they have adopted and what are their key findings on it. So this is how we discussed. Also we did discuss about the guidelines, what are the guidelines, or how the guidance has been provided to the built environment professions, what is existing and what is the lacuna. And also we did discuss about how these things could be improved. And then here we also discuss about the climate change, the scale of it, how one, because each assessment is focused on a particular scale, but how we have to integrate different scales. This is also we did discussed. And in the last module we talked about the communication, participation for people-centered development and education. So this is where when we talk about communication, education, the pedagogy also comes into the picture. When I was a student, there was not familiarity about the DRR in the architectural education. But then this is where I also tried to bring the philosophical perspectives of architectural education and the disaster risk reduction. So this is the brief skeleton of the disaster recovery and build back better. And if you look at the whole course, one of the important keywords which you come up, the theory, which we obviously discussed in the first modules and always discussed in other modules as well. Along with the live cases, we are also discussing about the theoretical aspects into it. Then the practice, how different practice setups have worked, and that is where how they produce different plans, different designs, and what kind of guidances it has developed. We discussed about PIAL, and we discussed about the tsunami regulations, we discussed the GSDMA regulations, like that. Then the third aspect is we discussed about the management part of it, which is the governance aspect, the participation, cooperation and the coordination. And the last part we discussed about the assessment and the communication, how the learnings has been communicated and how all that is one aspect of it, and also internally during the project or before the project, how this risk communication has been. So these are the key words. And then education, how to teach the DRR in the built environment education. So these are some of the keywords. I just tried to put it together. And you might have find very interesting diagrammatic illustrations where Shubho have showed each of the small concept, how he explained very simply. So you started with your discussions of the R is equal to H into V, how a perception of a nature and how it turns into a disaster, and how the impact is seen if the houses are there, and if it affects the flora and fauna, does it make an impact, or if it affects the habitat, does it make an impact, or if it affects the flora, it indirectly affects the habitat and the human survival. So like that he did explain the connections of each and every small aspect of nature and the human interventions. So that is what some of the pictures which you can remember from your course. And then the second part which Shubho have discussed is about the communications, and that is where what the sender and the receiver and what kind of information has been reaching and what is the gaps we are getting and how the perceptions keep changing. So this is where he defines risk communication is defined as any purposeful exchange of information about health, disaster, environmental risk between interested parties. So then again, there are three components which he also does: risk perception, risk analysis, and the risk management. So this is what most of the Subhash lectures on risk and also the communication, the perception, he covered these three important aspects. So one, when the sender sends a message, and then how the whole coding process and how he receives it, this whole what I mean and what I understand, there's all the gaps he tried to teach you. Then it is also about the information transmission is only one part of communication, and it also talks about it's not about what you understand, but it's about the shared meaning, and like, for example, how risk is perceived by different cultural contexts, the cultural theories. He brought about the cultural theory of risk. So this is where when you look at the snake, how different cultures, the Indian cultures pray to the snake, and some people take a videography, and some people talk about cutting it and eating it. Like that, there's different perceptions of the same thing. So this is where again, even a small color or a red light, how it is perceived in a different context. Now you have the same red light is used in as a kind of in a brothel houses in Amsterdam, and it's a significance of to stop over, and like that. It depends, the meaning of this red light depends on its context where it is placed. So that is where risk is cultural constructed, because we are all culturally biased, and it's all about how people perceive and act upon the world around them depends on their way of life. For them, for some people, how they are grown up, a small thing is a huge risk for them, but for the same thing may not be a risk at all. So it's all about the cultural belonging. So this is where we talk about, we have many risks, but how to prioritize the list. So this is the risk prioritization, because that is very much essential. It goes back to the planning principles of how we prioritize the risk and how we plan accordingly. How plan, instance, is not only the physical planning, how we plan our budgets, how we secure the whole process. That is how we have discussed. And in the third module, we also discussed the roles and the responsibilities, like the whole setup, and how there is a jargon between different professional bodies, how they have to contribute, what is the role of their contribution in the DRR. And that is where we refer to the Tony Lloyd Jones and Max Lock Center's work of the 4 different categories of surveyor, architects, and the engineer and the planner. So what are their roles and what stage? So in fact, even this course structure has been followed based on the way they have structured the phase wise. So the pre-disaster planning, during disaster, and the transition relief, and the reconstruction, and the last, how the adaptation process. That is how we have understood the different roles and their capacities, and how to use and when, what expertise we should use. Now, in the communication process, of course, when Shubho have dealt in detail about it, but it's also about the the ways how it is communicated. Like he discussed about the hearing and how the information is passed on, reading. So this whole networks, how there's NGOs and outsiders. How this social capital is social network of hearing is effectively used. So basically, the NGOs, how the central persons of the NGOs, and as well as some community members, how they are also linked with these networks. If a similar networks, if we have that during the tsunami, 2004 tsunami, it took 3 hours to reach the Indian Ocean tsunami to reach the Tamil Nadu. If this similar networks we would have implemented, we would have saved many lives, we would have saved many losses. And we also have discussed about the climate change adaptations, the scale of climate change, and what are the challenges between why we are unable to properly integrate the DRR and the climate change adaptation, because there are scale mismatches, there are spatial scale challenges, there are knowledge mismatches, and there are also the temporary challenges and mismatches between norms. So like that, there are various contexts which we discussed, and that is where how different cities are coping up with the climate change, and how Amsterdam, how their barrier, once upon a time they used to open only in 10 years, but now they are opening almost every 1 or 2 years. And we also had discussed about various adaptation process of floating houses. But similarly, we also looked in a critical way of, is it worth spending billions of amount of spending on floating houses, or is there any better ways to do it? And this is where we relate to the discussions of climate change and culture, in the Regina Lim's work of Philippines. So where how the indigenous communities have the knowledge on their sea and their fishing grounds, and the impact what they are seeing, and how the foreign fishermen, how they are able to not understand this indigenous knowledge and creating a lot of impact. So this is all we have learned, how cultures, indigenous cultures, do possess some knowledge on the risk. And this is where we discussed about the frameworks of the adaptive built environments, which my ongoing work about how to integrate different scales from a larger scale to a building scale, and also different time phases, which is the pre-disaster to the future risk, the post-disaster, and the future risk, and how the vulnerability assessment, how it can be carried by macro, meso, and the micro levels. And this is where we talk about different institutional bodies, how institutional cooperation, coordination, and again at participation in communication at the global and national and local levels. So this is where how to bring nature and culture together in understanding the disaster risk reduction and the climate change adaptation. So overall, that's the fundamental parts of the management philosophy of it, the theoretical philosophy of it, and some of the tools we have learnt about it. But the whole course is mainly focused on the built environment professions. How the nature of built environment, how it has an impact, and how it has been dealt, and how it has been responded. So that is where I call it as built environments in transition. So there are different cases we have come across, like in Kenya, how the transition shelter has been personalized later on, and how people have participated. And this is where I talk about the personalization is a natural response to cultural deficiency and also to the economic opportunities. So when we talk about the transition shelters, we did discuss about the Gujarat recovery, my own visits during that time, and how the schools were not there, and how different NGOs come forward, and how they supported the school educations with the and different technological inputs, paper houses and tents, the cost of it. But what we are seeing is from the transition onwards, how it moves on to the permanency. So that is where different NGOs have taken that very quickly with great participatory efforts. But here you can see some notice that how the community has come back to building with the stone, and the different professional bodies are giving some guidance on how to build it safer. In the whole course, what we did is we also come across different methods, how to understand the risk, how to understand the adaptation, how to understand the communication process, the gaps. So this is where we discussed about different methods of interviews, and some of the quantitative understanding, some of the mapping tools, mental maps, and by time wise how they varied, and different approaches, how to approach a community, the social level approaches, participatory approaches. All these we did discussed about it. And then in the tsunami case, we did discuss about how adaptations start, how a small house, how a toilet becomes a worship area, how a woman who lost her husband have shifted her house front as a shop. So in that way, they started encroaching the neighborhood lands for their public places. So this brings a larger perspective of the built environment perspective. This brings even the urban design aspects into a smaller planning a settlement. But if one has to look at the cultural adaptability, and that is where one has to we can see the same story after 80 years, how things have been modified in terms of their built forms, in terms of the street networks, in terms of the public spaces, how they have built. And this is where how tradition is coming back in a new form, in a hybrid form. So in all the cases, what we did discuss is about the process and the networks. So how the organizations have dealt with the communities and how it has been networked, but very macro level to the micro level agency. So we did discuss about the rural constructions in Colombia, where the coffee growers associations and how their organization structure, the institutional structures of the coffee growers organizations, and how their funding process, and how it has been developed, and how from a participatory approach, how the technical expertise have supported them in it. So how different funding platforms have been created to support these associations, and at the same time, what is the kind of response, and this is where we can see the prefab technology also have been adopted, and how people have been trained in it, and the technical expertise have been guiding them. So what you can see is like how some people have started repairing their houses and building the new houses. And similarly in Turkey, we have also learnt about how the renters, they are not recognized in the process, and that is where the small actors like NGOs, the community agencies came forward, and they also worked on different projects on it, right? And this whole discussion talks about the participation process and the facilitation process, and also the control mechanisms, who controls what. And this is what who will control the rules of the exercise and the facilitators. So in all these case studies, we have discussed about putting people in the center. So this is where Shubho have discussed about his Dharavi work in Bombay, and how the communities have understood the risk potential, and how they cross-verified it at the end. So this whole understanding, the community level understanding, this has been also some of the methods you have learnt. And assessments, how we come across in this course various assessment reports like global assessment reports, which is by Cassidy Johnson, where they talk about the building codes, and where the location approach and the design approach, and how the building codes doesn't match with the reality in Bangladesh. Despite of having the building codes, how the reality turns into vulnerable situations. Also, we did discuss about various other reports of South Asian disaster report, where it has covered in a kind of developing countries like Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and India. again, the frameworks. And I've referred with the good practice reviews work on John Twick's work of disaster risk reduction. And that is where he compiled everything, all these frameworks into one segment. So that's a very recent edition, and where we talked about the disaster risk and poverty nexus. Similarly, we talked about the DFID's resilience frameworks from the livelihood framework, how we moved on to the resilience frameworks. So this is all have been discussed. So when we talk about the resilience frameworks, and that at a global level, how the Sendai framework, how the Hugo framework for action, what are these priorities for action. So all these things we did discussed in different cases. In the institutional networks, how UN functions, what are the various bodies within which the UN is organized by its own setup. And we did also discuss about the community-based networks, that is where the CAM and CBDRM. So this is where the community asset management and the community-based disaster risk management. So how different social capitals and its network play an important role in reducing the disaster risk. And in the case of Nepal, we also discussed about how legally there is certain things which have not been acknowledged so far, how the bill remained as a bill and how it has not been turned into an act. So that is where the local disaster risk management planning guidelines, how it is not properly able to connect the disasters and development. So there should be ideally some kind of planning process which has to go within it. We did also discuss about various examples on heritage at risk, like Pitalkhora caves, the rock shelters, how they have been assessed with a geotechnological perspective. And similarly, we also discussed about how it has been rated and what kind of interventions have been formed. To make a small pillar, it might have taken to make a small canal. What are the various strict instructions we have to follow, what to touch and what not to touch, what to remove and what not to add. So all these things we have learned in that exercise. And there is one more, we have also described the city of Ayutthaya, how it has been subjected to risk. And we also discussed about Kiruna, the mining town. It's a scale of, so now starting from a cave, we talk about a historic precinct, and we talk about even a whole city of Kiruna, how it has been protected because of the mining issue. And after having the discussions of all this, we brought to the Camellia Bonus, the reconstruction space, how it can be theorized. Along with the Gibellina's case, what the lessons we have learned from Gibellina caves and the Turkish caves, Cappadocia caves. And this is how the theoretical understanding of the reconstruction space about how power, discourse, options and choices. Then we did discuss about the guidance, what are the various manuals that has provided guidance, what are the various kind of giving thumb rule directions to the practitioners. But in reality, though, despite of having this, what we can see is the reality of this Malakpur, Malakpet Bhuj, and how these things are happening, because this is where the planning control. And again, we did discuss about the guidelines for reconstruction of houses in tsunami, and the recent Kerala floods with Benny Kuriakose have derived in the local language, understanding the local context of it. And the CBRIs and the Ministry of Rural Development, how they worked on the rural housing technologies, how to validate these rural housing technologies, and especially in the 13 states which they have already worked on. So this is, we have just briefly gone through it. And then we also address about the philosophical content of the education. That is where the H.D. Chaya's work on the how the notion of I, we and our, and how it expands from the very essence of I, and that is where your realization to the self, to the society, and that can actually have a major impact on the DRR. So this and how it is related to architectural orientation. And that is where we talked about the pedagogy. And in the pedagogy, we did explain about various tools which I myself have used, adopted in different teaching exercises. That is one of the commonly practice the Build Back Better exercise, which I try to do with my students, is how they try to conceptualize the whole learnings from different continents in one single sheet, playing a role models, role plays, and these all different techniques of how, because we need to educate them into the real context, because we have to prepare them for the real context. So now that's the end of our summary, but now I'll conclude with what we learned in the same sheet of the same format. Disaster recovery and build back better, and this course, from each module, what are our key learnings? In the first module, and this recommends, please understand and know the theory first. That will, because theory always can connect you to for a better practice. The second module, we also learned about the mapping techniques, how first map the risk, prioritize the risk, and then you can it will help you in planning further. Third aspect, we talk about the set up the roles, how you organize yourself, understand what is the hierarchical process, what is the understand each of these roles and responsibilities. Then pre-disaster planning, prepare for the expected and, sorry, there's a spelling mistake here, prepare for the expected and also the unexpected. So that is the kind of preparation we need to go. Then in the relief and transition, don't undermine the local capacities, because at always the relief phase obviously undermines that these people doesn't know anything, that we have there to help them. But also there are ways how we need to think how, what are their relief, capacity, how they can build themselves. Learn from past, what are the learnings that sometimes we ignore them at that time of emergency. And in the reconstruction phase, we have to understand the transition process, putting people in the center. In assessments, there are important points which we touched upon, the building codes, lack of the regulatory process, but make sure that you don't do a very superficial survey, because many of the reports only point on the numbers, how many houses we have built, but we have to see how it has been adapted, how it has been successful. So this is one thing which we have taken away. Then the communication, communicate, educate and participate for the real. So even in the education perspective, in the communication, take things in a realistic way. Otherwise, because you are preparing, even in the students, we are preparing for the real issues. So try to make sure you take it in that approach. I think that's the end of our course, and I thank each and every participant for their wonderful participation, and we hope to see you in further courses. Thank you very much.